Hello and happy Juneteenth. We have been marking the end of slavery in the Western edition since 1854. But today, here at 1375 Fillmore Street, Bruno's Pizzeria, this is the first time we've done it on a federal holiday. My name's John Williams Templeton, and I have lived in the neighborhood for 29 years. And for about half of that time, I've been the official historian of San Francisco Juneteenth. We have a special pride for the federal holiday because in 1949, San Francisco was the first place outside of Texas to actually observe Juneteenth. And that was because the Western tradition worldwide is essentially an annex of Texas. There were so many people who came from Texas here that the leading nightclub was called the Texas Playhouse. And the hotel that was black owned was called the Hotel Texas. And so the gentleman who owned both of those establishments started San Francisco Juneteenth, and he would ride down this street on a horse. And just as we're beaming this out now, pictures of him riding that white horse down the street in San Francisco went back to Texas. And so many folks in Texas who were facing lynchings, burning houses, racial discrimination, said, you know what, maybe I want to move to San Francisco because I can find other people from Texas like me. One of those people was Willie Lewis Brown. Uncle Instinct was out here on Fillmore, and was a hustler. Made money in a lot of different ways, but his nephew Willie Brown said, "I want to come out," and he worked in the basement of the church. Worked his way through San Francisco State. Went to Hastings School of the Law. And by 1963, he was in the California Assembly. That was a long time before anybody in Texas got in the state legislature. So the Western Addition has a special place in the hearts of Texas. And we're going to explore those connections, not only in modern history, but in the history of the past, long before you can imagine. One point we want to make tonight is that although our country has decided to recognize Juneteenth, almost nobody knows about the reason for Juneteenth. That includes most white people. For the last 30 years, I have been a textbook publisher. We wrote the 4-volume history of African Americans in California. And over the last 15 years, we did a trilogy on the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Because we found out that most people have no idea how the Black experience in the Americas began. They don't know why the events happened. And I did an exercise about 5 years ago with a student right up the hill at Wallenberg. And I asked them, what do you know about slavery in the Bible? And they all immediately shouted, 25 of them, Moses crossed the Red Sea and freed the Hebrews. Well, What you know about African Americans who were enslaved? Only one of them raised his hand. And I noticed his voice was getting lower and his hand was getting lower. That was. So when we were over there and they came and got us, and we were over here. So I asked him, I said, you just notice the difference in your response when you talk about Hebrew slavery? You started confused. But when you talk about blacks who were enslaved, you never talked about how they overcame. I said, how did you see yourself? You thought of yourself as people who overcame the worst people in human history. And they said, we would think we could do anything. I said, bingo. So we want to put Juneteenth in the proper context of not a gift, not a revelation, but a victory. And a victory that is hard fought, a victory that was intentional, and a victory that displayed courage, dedication, and all the values that everyone considers honored. So let's start with what Juneteenth is. Because about 15 years ago, Dexter Woods and Lou Gehrig, who were managing the annual Juneteenth celebration. Dexter was the captain for the Black Panthers. So every new branch of the Black Panthers, Dexter was responsible for starting it up. That's kind of living history in this neighborhood. Lou Gehrig was one of the strikers at San Francisco State who did the longest student strike in American history and got the College of Ethnic Studies in 1968. So these people had an institutional history about the institution, the tradition of San Francisco Juneteenth. And Gehrig had originally grown up in Texas, near Marshall. So they asked me to be the historian for San Francisco Juneteenth. And I sort of looked at him quizzing because very few historians pay any attention to it. It was notable that there was no book on Juneteenth. There were no scholarly articles on Juneteenth. So I went to a bulletin board on African American history that I participated in. And I got asked, what actually happened on June 19th, 1865? Because as a historian of African Americans in the West, I knew that this area had been on slavery, and that slavery had ended in the 1700s, and it had specifically ended when Mexico became independent in 1821. So it didn't make sense to me that people in Texas, only 10 years before been part of Mexico, wouldn't know what was going on. So 20 minutes later, I get a response from the scholar who wrote the history of Texas and another historian who wrote the history of African Americans. They said we've been waiting 20 years for somebody to ask us. So they were kind of undone because they said, you know, this myth is the most ridiculous thing you've ever heard. And so I'm not going to repeat the myth, but we'll give you some talking points. Because so often in my career as a historian in African American experience, I find that the primary sources are 180 degrees different from what people think. And so I like to keep my readers in mind so that when they learn something from me, and then go out and repeat it and get, you know, a lot of people, you know, deny it. They have to actually defend what they learned. So on January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. And on January 1st, 1863, Galveston, Texas, which was the capital of Texas, was under the control of the Union Army and Navy. So, as was the entire Texas coast, which was being occupied in October 1862, a month after the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. So the idea of people in Galveston, I know about the Emancipation Proclamation. Galveston was actually the first Confederate state capital that was captured. Second, the Corps d'Afrique, which was 19 regiments that were raised among people who had come out of slavery in Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. They had fought with General Grant and General Sherman in the campaign to occupy Vicksburg and to control the entire Mississippi River. So, 3 regiments from Corps d'Afrique and the 62nd U.S. colored troops from Missouri were assigned to Brazos, Santiago on the mouth of the Rio Grande. And their mission was to keep France from America across the top. Most people have no idea of the role of the American Civil War. We have this very narrow perspective that really tied to a few personalities. The deadliest war in American history. The Civil War killed more people than World War I, World War II, Vietnam, all combined. Many people. But we know very little about it. And so the narrative of the Civil War starts with Fort Sumter and the firing these are this area. But we learned very quickly about what they're up to. So in 1857, there was another civil war. And the result of that civil war was that the Mexican economy was flat. Mexico couldn't pay its bills. And so England, Spain, and France invaded Mexico, 1859. So no one mentions the impact of Mexico. But when we look at the motivation of a group of people who decided to break up the country, it was essentially them trying to take advantage of an opportunity because there had been threats in the 1830s southern states see from the and the issue was the tariffs on cotton. So cotton was the number one commodity in the United States. From the rest of the century. Most of it was grown in the southern states. But fair policy meant that you could only ship it to the north. Well, the Southerners saw the opportunity to get a better deal by shipping cotton to Europe. So when Britain and France invaded Mexico, they started two opportunities. One to get out of the tariffs, and two to spread slavery in Mexico, where it was generations before. So we need to look at that as a big part of the motivations for breaking up the union. And so the first campaign of the union was to occupy and stop trade between Mexico and Confederates. So there was an unexpected actor in the game. When the French invaded Mexico, they thought it would be a walk in the park. But in May 1862, unorganized farmers defeated the French at the Battle of Puebla. And that meant that the French would leave Mexico City until 1864. So the timing of this interruption came right before the Emancipation Proclamation in the United States. And so as we mark Juneteenth, one of the things that we should look at is the connection between Juneteenth and Cinco de Mayo. And so
They tried the best they could to do that.
so we have Galveston being part of the U.S. We have U.S. troops of African descent in Texas from 1863. We have a mission of strategic importance. And so then we get to April of 1865. Third capital Richmond. The first units to enter Richmond are the 29th Connecticut province. U.S. troops of African descent. Joined by 31st Regiment U.S. troops of African descent. Wow. City of Richmond gets burned down. Jefferson Davis flees. Robert E. Lee heads west. The 25th Corps, which is 14 regiments of all black troops, pursues 5,000 troops from the 25th Corps. Seize the railroad line. Setting up a magic courthouse. Force being surrendered. So the lost cause ideology, which has sort of infiltrated understanding. So yes, the right and the Ron is coming back and Adam got totally after killing 1 million Americans. How different is that story? If the story is that Lee was cut off by black troops and was forced to surrender. That's what happened. So the surrender of Lee was not intentional. So as Lee specifically said in his surrender document, he was only surrendering his troops under his command. So over the next few weeks, other Confederate armies had to be convinced to surrender too. And Jefferson Davis was still on the loose until the effect. So just because we surrendered, and it was obviously a great national celebration about that, because that was the focal point of the war. There are still Confederate armies across. So on April 5th, a unit of U.S. colored troops called colored divisions occupied Mobile. Back in February, U.S. colored troops occupied Mobile. So over the 2 year period like that, we've gone from having no African Americans in the U.S. Army to 209,000 So by the end of the war, 60% of U.S. Army was U.S. Because when the war started in 1861, people had a 3-year enlistment. Well, those 3 years expired in 1864. Yeah. And so at the very time that most people started going to the army, the very time that white were leaving. And so it was understood at the time, the job is good like 9 out of 10 times, that soldiers had won the war. Not just because of their sons, but because a million African Americans left and moved to the Union. So 3.6 million African Americans in slavery. And a million of them left. Now that means 2.5 million were still in slavery. The other thing that we have to be that the emancipation proclamation did not actually free anybody. It was a bargaining document. Lincoln had brought out in September 22nd, 1862. If the Confederacy will lay down its arms, I will allow you to keep your slaves. On January 1st, God wanted to declare any slaves in Confederate territory free. So, Confederacy, they thought that people in the North would be just as opposed to Indian slavery as people in the North. And so the impact of the Emancipation Proclamation was that it authorized African Americans to join the Army. And it meant that the fugitive slave law got enforced. So if you did leave, you wouldn't be returned. And so let's look at the mechanism of how people act like this. I've heard of the term Sherman's March to Georgia. The Union Army defeat the South. The Union Army had to burn the South down. Had to destroy everything. And so, in order for a group of African Americans on a plantation to leave, the Union Army came and burned that. So, where that did happen, people went free. And so, as we look at the grand strategy of what was happening, this is a map that we've done of the order of battle. So the stars show engagements of victories by Black troops. And then this large arrow here is when General Grant shifts the 25th Corps from Virginia to Texas in May 1865. And he did that because Texas had been cut off when they occupied the city. And so in Texas, there was no damage. So people that continued to operate their plantations in Texas, bring in foreign currency for the Confederacy. And when the Union Army shipped its resources to the Mississippi Valley, the Confederates had seized Galveston again in order to use the port to ship the cotton. So Galveston had been in but the Texans had American superiority once the Union focuses resources on Virginia and Georgia. So they were able to get the continent out of Galveston. So that's why Galveston returned to the Union after the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. But the key point was that no African Americans became free until a Union showed up, soldiers showed up with a bayonet, stuck it in the slave master's face, and said, "Let the people go." So the last part that people should understand is that Texas was a third of the size of the Confederacy. It has already declared its independence from Mexico. Some folks in Texas say, we don't have surrender. We can make it our own. So you had two Confederate generals in charge of Texas, went to Mexico City in May and met with the French Emperor in Mexico. And said, "Hey, I want to join forces with you." But the French saw how the war was going. They saw that the Union was prevailing, and they said, "Nah, we're good." So the 25th Corps was sent to Texas specifically to stop the Confederates from joining forces with the French. So the reason that African Americans in Texas had not been free as other parts because the Union Army had not purchased. And June 19th, 1865 was Union Army showing up there because it actually took another year going plantation to plantation for the Union Army to actually free African Americans in Texas. So if the Emancipation Proclamation didn't end slavery, if Juneteenth didn't end slavery in Texas, if the telegram that Lisa rendered arrived in Texas a week afterward in April, if Confederates were trying to cut a deal with the French, why should we recognize Juneteenth? The reason is that the general order that General Granger did represents far more than diplomatic support. The end of the civil because Mexico was the last thing to vote. And these general orders were issued in each state once they were captured. So Juneteenth isn't a country. Juneteenth is the main act of Congress. So not only is it more appropriately described as in the war, but it also is connected to the narrative of how we understand it. Because W.E.B. Du Bois described the Civil War as the slave rebellion. And so the real story and real significance of the Civil War is not that Lee and Davis had a conversation, but that in 1860, as we see right here, there were 3.6 million black folks in slavery. And by the end of 1865, they were all free. So if you think the Hebrews crossing the Red Sea is a big deal, and 4 million people against the people the places where they didn't or the Jews because Lincoln and put a piece of paper saying, their freedom comes because of their own cases. And so that's the message that we need to party who are new because when you have the Texas Constitution, the majority of the people voted for the Constitution of Texas were black. Majority of the people voted in Georgia. And so there was many black voter turnout between 1862 and 1870. So that's why we have the 13th Amendment. That's why we got the 14th Amendment. When they passed the 13th Amendment, they said, well, we became slavery because there was sort of okay, well, follow through with Lincoln. But they said, well, there's no way we can give citizenship to black people. Right? So they had the Joint Reconstruction Committee. And testimony from black folks in all of the states, amendment volumes. And so people heard about the riot and the looting and beating that was undergoing in the South after the end of the war. Says the protection of the law. 14th Amendment also says you cannot hire anybody. They don't participate in its insurrection. Also says that public debt has a full faith credit of the United States. So that is probably the most important part of the 14th Amendment because our entire financial system rests on the full faith credit of the United States. So Wall Street, black folks, they did. And we have the legislative history of all those amendments in our trilogy on those amendments. And after the 14th Amendment, they said, well, we got citizenship. We ended slavery. But white folks never voted. But black people never voted. So even the radical Republicans said, no, right? Well, so people thought about the fact that it was black soldiers who would save the country. And they said, well, they fought for the country, they should be able to vote. And all of the legislative history says, well, if these black men fought for the country, they should have the right to vote. And what was interesting was somebody said, well, if you do it for black folks, then we have to do it for the Chinese. And the response was, no, we ain't talking about the Chinese. I mean, that's the testimony. They said, no, not talking about Chinese. They said, just the black folks. Now keep in mind, still 50 years before white women got to. But that tells you how important the role of black soldiers was in the Civil War. So, in addition to just the overall victory, Juneteenth really is an expression of the victory of U.S. troops of African descent to save the country. And so, as we look at today's issue, we need to have that same attitude about people who want to take away the right to vote from African Americans today, even in Texas. We need to remind them that the 15th Amendment was won on the battlefield. 13th Amendment was won on the battlefield. 14th Amendment was won on the battlefield. And even after the 209,145 U.S. troops who won the Civil War, we had 150,000 U.S. troops of African descent in the Spanish American War, 400,000 in the First World War, 2 million in World War II. So this was before the end of Jim Crow. So we've got 4 million African Americans who have served in the military. And it's got to be that history that we talk about on Juneteenth. Not the idea that we were just kind of sitting around saying, oh, my, we're free now. You know, and we have a short video about this, and we sarcastically asked if somebody can drink the red Kool-Aid now. We start talking about his response, right? And my response was, right here in the Western Tradition, we figured out, you ought to think twice before you drink Kool-Aid. He found out who makes the Kool-Aid, what the backstory is on that Kool-Aid. So, as I think about folks like Dexter Woods and Lou Garrett, Will Usry, Mary Helen Rogers, Geraldine Johnson, who came out from the South and took advantage of the opportunities here in the Western Addition and in San Francisco. We need to redouble the message that they created through San Francisco Juneteenth. That we shouldn't take a backseat to anybody. That we have earned, we have won, we have fought for everything that we have, and we're not going to settle for anything less than the best. And so, before folks in Texas got a chance to experience those opportunities, folks from Texas came to San Francisco and set the path. By the 1980s, folks from San Francisco worked with people in South Africa and helped end apartheid. So this connection between Texas and San Francisco is very meaningful. Even before the Civil War, we have 3 churches in this neighborhood that are 170 years old. And all of those churches were part of the Underground Railroad. And in the 1850s, they said our stated purpose is ending American chattel slavery. And the $30,000 that Mary Ellen Pleasant took to John Brown in Ontario came from those three churches. So those three churches didn't just complain about slavery, they took action to make the end of it occur. And the leaders of those churches, after the end of the Civil War, all moved to the South, became leaders of black denominations in the South. And so there are so many connections between San Francisco and the end of slavery that we should take particular pride in making Juneteenth a federal holiday. But the thing that we really should focus on is making sure that economic freedom, that personal freedom, that educational freedom, financial freedom, that the people expected on Juneteenth, that we actually make that happen. So I thank everybody for joining us and enjoy all the red Kool-Aid you want on Saturday.